So far in this application, we have worked with a single component. So if you look at index.js, you can see we are rendering a single counter component in the DOM. But as I told you before, a React application is essentially a tree of components. So we can compose components together to build complex user interfaces. And that's what we're going to do in this lecture. So I'm going to add a new component to our application. Here in the components folder, let's add a new file, counters.jsx. In this component, I want to render a list of counters. And then in index.js, instead of rendering a counter component, I want to render a counters component. With this change, our component tree will look like this. Okay, so back in index.js, instead of importing the counter component, let's import counters from the counters module and render that here. Now, back to our new component. On the top, imrc tab, cc tab. Let's call this counters. Okay. Now, in the render method, let's add a div. This is going to be the wrapper or the container for all our counters because we want to return a single element from the render method, right? So here, we want to add multiple counter components. First, on the top, we need to import the counter component from the current folder, counter module. Now here, let's render a few counter components. Save the changes. Back in the browser, you can see we have multiple counter components. Each component has its own state that is completely isolated from the other components. Beautiful. Now let's take this to the next level. Instead of hard coding these counter components here, let's add an array of counter objects to our state property and render them using the map method. So here, let's add a new property, counters. We set it to an array. In this array, we're going to have counter objects like this. Each object should have an ID property, and we're going to use this to uniquely identify each counter. We should also have a value property, and we'll later use this to set the initial value for each counter. For now, I'm going to set this to 0. Now let's duplicate this multiple times and change the IDs. Okay, beautiful. Finally, let's get rid of these counters. Instead, we want to render an expression. Here, this, .state, .counters, .map. We get each counter and map it to a counter component. Also, we should set the key property to counter.id. Save the changes. We still get the same output, and each counter has its own state. Beautiful. However, all our counters are initialized to 0, and the value that we set here is not applied to this counter components. So if I change the value of the first counter to 4, we still get a counter initialized to 0. We'll fix that in the next lecture.